Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Thursday, February the 6th, and welcome to our commentary. Well, there's something very interesting about February the 6th, and I just want to touch on a couple of very important things about this date, February the 6th. A couple of very important people were born on this day. We're going to talk a little bit about it because I have a post over at the American Thinker today talking about Babe Ruth, who was born on this day in 1895. He passed away in 1948. Now, the post that I have over at the American Thinker is about Babe Ruth going to Cuba back in 1920. He went to Cuba several times in the 1920s, but in the winter of 2021, of 1920 21, he actually went down to Cuba and had exhibition games, and he played a bunch of Cuban teams and some other Cuban professional teams as well, and had a very successful tour of Cuba. In fact, it was a smash. They paid him a lot of money to go too, by the way. He was promoted a lot in the island. And of course, at that time, you had a Cuban professional league that was sort of starting to take off, and they needed that kind of promotion. This was the Cuban Winter League that for a very long time, really, until Castro came to power, was the top of the cream of the top, or whatever the expression is, the top winter baseball league that was played in Cuba, and many major leaguers would go to play baseball in Cuba in the winter. Primarily, some of the young ones who were trying to make an impression on their team. You know, you go to Cuba, you have a good winter league season, and then you go to spring training, and you've got that performance in Cuba on your resume. So this is why people like Brooks Robinson and Willie Mays, just to think of a couple of Hall of Famers who went to Cuba. There were others as well. I think Stan Musial played in Cuba as well. And then, of course, you had a bunch of Cuban players who would also play in that league. You know, Minnie Minoso, who is currently in the Hall of Fame. Camilo Pascual, who was quite a pitcher here in the United States in the early 1960s. He was one of the later ones who was able to transfer to the major league. So there was a lot of enthusiasm in Cuba for the Cuban Winter League, and the Babe went down there and had a great time. I mean, just had a blast of a time, as well as made a bunch of money and made a lot of fans for the Cuban Winter League that was so successful in 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. That league, by the way, that Winter League, my father was a huge fan of that growing up in Cuba at that time. And, they would listen to the games on the radio, and it was just a lot of excitement to watch Cuban baseball at that time. And Babe Ruth, who was born on this day in 1895 and passed away a very young age. He passed away of cancer in 1948, was a big star back in the 1920s. He took a couple of trips to Cuba. So check out my post over at the American Thinker. The other very famous person who was born on this day was President Ronald Reagan, who was born in 1911 and, of course, passed away in 2004, was the 40th president of the United States. He pretty much served the entire decade of the 80s, from 1981 to 1989. He was preceded by the late President Jimmy Carter, who passed away not long ago. And he was followed by his vice president, George Bush, who was president for one term. So Ronald Reagan, there's so many things you can say about him, but I think the most important thing that you can say about Reagan is that he communicated so well. He spoke so well. And there's a couple of speeches that really stand out in my mind when I think of President Reagan. Well, there's so many, but I'm going to tell you about two that I think are just fabulous. The first one is the speech that he gave on what was then the 40th anniversary of D-Day. That would have been 1984, so June 6, 1984. By the way, ironically, Ronald Reagan died on June 6, on what would have been, I guess, the 60th or 70th anniversary of D-Day, but that's just one of those coincidences. But anyway, so he gave this amazing speech at the site of one of the landings of D-Day, and it was a great speech because many of the veterans of D-Day were there, and they were still, I guess most of them were men in their 60s, late 60s, and they were able to attend. Most of them were able to make it without too much difficulty, including their families. And if you ever want to hear an amazing speech by an American president, check out his speech. It's in YouTube, there's also a Reagan website, the Reagan Library website, where you can see it. It's just an amazing speech, and it just told you everything you needed to know about President Reagan, his style, his way of talking, everything about him. It was just amazing, the speech that he gave that day. Of course, the other great speech of Ronald Reagan was in a very unhappy day, and that was the day that the Challenger exploded, January 1986. When you had that terrible tragedy, there was a teacher on board, and there were many kids across the country who were watching the takeoff because the teacher was on board, and this thing, the Challenger exploded, I guess, a couple of minutes after takeoff, and the whole country saw this. I happened to be at a restaurant when this happened, and I saw that on TV. I couldn't believe it. But anyway, that was a great speech, because that was a speech where he had to speak not only to the nation, but he had to speak to a bunch of kids, high school kids, who had seen this and must have been traumatized completely by the idea that a teacher who was on board exploded that day. So those two speeches really stand out in my mind as two of the great speeches, two of the great presidential speeches ever. Of course, he has a bunch of others that, if you go to the Reagan Library, many other speeches when he was president that were absolutely great as well. But those two really stand out in my mind because I remember them. I remember them so well. So we remember today President Reagan, again, who was born in 1911 and passed away in 2004. Here's a little trivia for you. And it amazes me a little bit. Reagan turned 70 like a couple of weeks after becoming the 40th president. He was inaugurated the 20th of January and turned 70 on the 6th of February. So when he left the presidency, he was actually 78, or about to be 78 when he left the presidency. That means that Joe Biden and now President Reagan are actually older than Reagan. In other words, when Reagan left the White House, he was 78, 77, about to turn 78. That's the age of President Biden when he became president. And I'm not sure about President Trump, but I think he's up there as well. So it just goes to show you how much older presidents can be these days. You never had presidents that old before. I mean, even Eisenhower was 70 by the time he left the presidency. So anyway, just a little interesting detail about President Reagan. Something else, too, you can do for fun to remember President Reagan is watch some of his movies, because he had quite a few movies. None of them were first-rate movies. A lot of times he was the second actor in the movie, the B actor, as they like to call him. So he was sort of the sidekick many times in the movie. But still, when you watch a Reagan movie, it really, really hits you, because you're watching the movie and it's like you're listening to Reagan as president. The same tone, the same mannerisms. I mean, the same voice, of course, the same communication skill. And it just hits you like, wow, there's President Reagan in a movie. He made some cowboy movies as well that you might want to go back and check out. So we remember today Babe Ruth and Ronald Reagan on February the 6th. Just a couple of highlights from the news. There's a total media breakdown going on right now with a CBS interview. That is the most appalling thing that I've seen. And I'm not one of those who likes to see the media fail, because I think it's extremely important that we have a good media in the country, because a good media is necessary in a democracy. You've got to have reporters who people believe, and you got to have news programs that people believe. If people don't believe the media, you're not doing very well. But right now, after watching that CBS interview or reading the transcript, I mean, it's obvious that CBS was trying to help out Vice President Harris. And that is just going to tear up the whatever popularity or integrity there was left in CBS. They're going to have a very difficult time recovering from this. They're just going to have a very difficult time recovering from this. Of course, the other little scandal has to do with USAID and the $8 million they gave to political. Again, any serious journalist has to look at that and go, wait a minute, why is political getting $8 million from the government? What is this all about? The other thing too is that political never disclosed it. So they were covering stories and not letting the readers know that part of their funding was coming from USAID. So this is really embarrassing, I think, for the media. And I feel bad for some of the good reporters. Most of the reporters I've met over the years are good people who are trying to do their job. But they must be embarrassed by things like these. I just don't know how else to say it. One big story today that we'll talk about more, I suppose, in the next few days is that the Department of Justice is going after the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois regarding sanctuary cities. And it's about time. It's about time. These cities cannot, selectively enforce federal law. You've got to enforce everything, and that includes immigration. So hopefully they come down very hard on these cities, and we have a tough approach, not just against Chicago, but some of the other cities that have decided that, they don't have to respect immigration laws. Well, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. You have to respect federal law. If you don't like the federal law, fine, you can change it. But for the time being, you have to respect the law the way it is. So congratulations to the Department of Justice, the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, for going after these cities for violating the law. They're violating the law. There's no other way of putting it. Have a great day, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.